Hi,
Greetings,
everyone.
everyone.
My name is Raquel with Redmond Magazine, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. The topic of today's webcast is Identity-Centric Healthcare Security, Defending the First Responders, sponsored by Semperis. A background on our sponsor, Semperis is the pioneer of identity-driven cyber resilience for cross-cloud and hybrid environments. The company provides cyber preparedness, incident response, and disaster recovery solutions for enterprise directory services, the keys to the kingdom. Semperis' patented technology for Microsoft Active Directory protects over 40 million identities from cyber attacks, data breaches, and operational errors. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of today's presentation, so please type any questions that you may have in the Q&A box. Semperis has also provided some resources which correspond with today's webinar, so please take a moment to check those out. And additionally, this webcast is being recorded, so keep an eye out for a link in your email to rewatch the presentation or share it with a colleague. Now I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers. Today we will hear from Gil Kirkpatrick, a Microsoft MVP and Chief Architect from Semperis, as well as Luke Kane, a Solution Architect at Semperis as well. So we are in great hands today, and with that, I'll pass the time over to the Semperis team to get us started.
Thanks, Raquel. Healthcare organizations have been brutalized by cybercrime of all sorts. Virtually all healthcare organizations have been hit in the last couple of years or so. I think the number is close to 90%. And the costs associated with the fines, the lost data, lost productivity, ransom payments, all of that is going from somewhere around $6 billion in 2017 to over $8 billion in 2020. It's kind of ironic, but the very first verified ransomware attack occurred in 1989. So we're talking about DOS and floppy disks at this point. And it targeted the healthcare industry as well. In this case, it was a bunch of individuals who were attending an AIDS conference put on by the World Health Organization in Stockholm. And today, healthcare organizations are still in the crosshairs for cyber attack, although the stakes are, of course, a lot higher. I think back then, the ransom that was demanded on the floppy disk was $189. Today, it's often in the hundreds of thousands or even millions. Ransomware attacks have been increasing at a substantial rate for healthcare organizations, with the total cost of ransomware itself, not all cybercrime, just ransomware, running about $160 million a year. Ironically, the COVID pandemic has actually resulted in a decrease in actual ransomware attacks. It's sort of as if the criminals are thinking that maybe we shouldn't be attacking healthcare industries because they're just being good people.
Hello?
To actually be found a cause of a death of someone because of the ransomware attack, that would be a pretty bad situation for them. Organizations. Luke, you've had some experience with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, because those are some pretty sobering statistics. I know from my personal experience that ransomware and malware in general is a major concern for all business leaders in the healthcare sector. I spearheaded actually a high availability project for a Fortune 100 healthcare company a few years ago. And these cyber threats that you're talking about were key when evaluating high availability solutions for all critical business applications. At the time, my role was focused primarily on identity management, chiefly Active Directory, and recovery of a large healthcare enterprise environment.
Yeah, and healthcare environments tend to be really complicated, which makes that whole thing really difficult. So just quick introductions. Luke, why don't you just introduce yourself and give a brief statement about your background, and then I'll follow up.
Absolutely. So my name is Luke Kane, and as noted a moment ago, I spent several years as a security engineer for a large healthcare company. Prior to that, I spent a significant amount of time in the government sector supporting a lot of the agencies.
And my name's Gil Kirkpatrick. I'm the chief architect at Semperis. I've been a Microsoft MVP for directory services for the last 16 years. I wrote the original book on programming for Active Directory, and I've been involved in identity management related products going back to Banyan Networks and Novell, NDS, and eDirectory and Active Directory, and other identity systems as well. So, talking about what it is that makes healthcare organizations such a ripe target for criminal activity. There are a lot of reasons for this, but maybe the first one is the complexity of the IT environments that healthcare organizations usually have. I've found them to be some of the most complicated systems anywhere, and there are a few reasons. First off, healthcare is easily the most heavily regulated industry in the US, and there's probably a dozen different federal agencies that have some sort of regulatory jurisdiction over healthcare companies. And of course, each state has several agencies as well. They've got their own hospital agencies to regulate the local hospitals. They've got their own insurance agencies within the state governments to regulate insurance and so on. So that creates a monstrous load on IT, both to provide all of the reporting data that they have to satisfy the regulatory requirements, but also a lot of those organizations impose security requirements on the IT infrastructure as well. So the IT organization has to meet those. So Luke, what was your exposure to regulatory issues?
You know, it's funny, you mentioned that. I didn't realize there's so many different aspects with regulations within the industry. I mean, obviously everyone's familiar with PHI, HIPAA, PCI DSS, SOX, you know, a lot of the big ones. But I know there's a lot of cybersecurity professionals listening in today, myself included, who can attest to the fact that there's many times when us grunt workers put in more effort towards meeting those compliancy than actual proactive security processes, and then the technical controls that surround those processes. I think we're going to flesh this out a little later when we delve into some of those real world scenarios we talk about. Yeah.
And to sort of compound that, the complexity imposed by regulatory requirements is also a massive amount of merger and acquisition activity going on in the healthcare sector. Mm-hmm. I mean, absolutely. Most of these healthcare organizations just grow over time by buying up new clinics, hospitals, even pharmaceutical companies. And every time an organization goes through that, it's a huge load on IT to try to incorporate the new IT organization into their existing infrastructure. There was a report that Deloitte did a while ago that indicated that for most IT M&A activity, IT integration, most healthcare M&A activity, IT integration was like a second or third order issue in the transaction. Mm-hmm. So what that means is, of course, that the result of that IT integration is a bit of a mess, and it injects a lot of additional complexity into the overall system.
Yep. Yeah, Luke. I was just saying, I can attest to what you're saying is actual, right? It's more of an afterthought than it is the primary motivator, but absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And all of that, of course, means more work for the IT staff, which means less time and effort available to work on real security problems. There's another issue in oh, Luke?
Yes, my bad. I apologize there. You were talking about mergers and acquisitions. I kind of got lost in your thought there. So a lot of my time and effort, my time and effort in the field, I spent both preparing for and delivering on the mergers and acquisitions, and it can become increasingly complex when you're trying to assess the security posture of incoming for mergers and outgoing for the mergers and acquisition and outgoing facilities, and all the complexities around how difficult it will be to adopt the existing policies within the organization. Now, certainly there's utilities out there to help with some of these battles, but like you mentioned earlier, ultimately a lot of time and preparation has to be spent assessing the critical business applications and whether or not they can be adequately supported. But yeah, that's all I have there.
By the acquiring organization. Yeah, I know it's
correct.
I've never been in a healthcare organization that didn't have a whole ton of chewing gum and baling wire trying to get all the systems to work together. It's always been a mess.
Amen.
So that's one of the things that makes the IT organization a little more susceptible to cyber attacks. Another one is staff turnover. So not necessarily so much in the IT org, although that's an issue there as well, but in the line staff, so the hospital staff, the clinic staff, and all of that. There's a massive amount of turnover. In Becker's hospital review, they indicated that roughly 70% of the nursing staff across the board reported feeling burnt out in their current position, which means that they're more inclined to leave. Overall, the turnover in the healthcare industry runs something like 30% a year, which, when you think about it, that means that you have 30% of your staff leaving every year and a new 30% coming in, and those people have to be trained in all your security processes. They have to be onboarded into your IT systems in some way. So if your onboarding and offboarding processes aren't fully automated, if they aren't working together properly, if you're not provisioning those new users into your applications properly, that again is yet another area where the IT staff gets overburdened with having to deal with it. And it's another area where there's risk of vulnerability. If you're relying on manual processes to provision new users into your applications, it just means that more mistakes can get made and opens up the door to criminals getting access to your IT systems.
Absolutely.
And there's another weird sort of problem that's kind of unique to the healthcare industry, and that's especially in hospitals, and that's the idea of a doctor who has hospital permissions or privileges. So they're not employees really, so they're not necessarily subject to the same kinds of restrictions you can put on your own employees, but they end up using your IT systems in the hospital. So they'll come in every couple of weeks, sit down in front of a computer, update some records, print off a report, do whatever. But you can't necessarily hold them to the same level of training requirements that you might to the normal hospital staff. And if anybody's had to try and train a doctor on any kind of a IT system, you know that can be a challenging proposition for sure.
Amen.
So another thing that makes healthcare organizations, especially hospitals, challenging from a security standpoint are the number of connected devices. And this was sort of eye-opening for me. I knew it was a thing. I did not realize how big a thing it was. But a typical hospital room will have 15 to 20 network-connected medical devices. And if you look at the overall large hospital, it might have 85,000 connected devices, which way outnumbers the actual IT systems, so the desktop systems and servers and such. And all of those are connected in a sort of trusted fashion on the network. It used to be that we would organize our networks in a way that anything that was inside the firewall was trusted and anything outside the firewall was not. And we know, of course, now that is probably a bad assumption. The medical devices on the network are usually unmonitored and unmanaged, and they often suffer from software or firmware vulnerabilities. And if you're not all over those, they just go unpatched, and it leaves your organization open to an attack through that vector. There was a group of 19 separate vulnerabilities called Ripple 20, which I think was, when did that get publicized? I think in June, maybe, this year. But it was essentially the TCP IP stack that is in the firmware on an embedded device that is used in all kinds of different machinery, including a lot of healthcare machinery, had a bunch of vulnerabilities in it that were remote execution 0 days. And that particular piece of hardware shows up in medical equipment by companies from like Baxter or Schneider Electric or Smiths Medical. And it can be in the environmental control systems. It doesn't really matter. They're connected to the network, which means that they pose a vulnerability. Luke?
Yep. You said Ripple 20. That's the first time I've heard that. I was Googling the background here. I'm not familiar with that one. But everything you're talking about, I mean, all the stats on here, 15 to 20 connected devices within the healthcare vertical, that's referred to as the Internet of Medical Things, or IOMT. And you're right, managing and patching these devices in a centralized manner can become quite cumbersome. We're talking about everything from the thermostat to the hospital bed, the nurse's call system, defibrillators, barcode scanning for logistics purposes, and everything in between. Some of those devices require connectivity to AD for things like DNS resolution. And obviously this can become particularly problematic when we're integrating Linux devices with static records in DNS, especially during upgrades down the road where we've got to upgrade those static records. So, I mean, just thinking through that, obviously there's a lot to that. It's a lot of complexity there.
Yep, and there's a lot more work for the IT staff again.
Amen.
So another thing that makes healthcare organizations a big target to cybercrime is the data that they hold. And it's not just, just the usual enterprise credentials that the bad guys like to steal. Healthcare records overall are really, really valuable on the dark web. So if you look to buy a username and password, or maybe a social security number on the dark web that goes for like $1 a piece or something, credit card numbers might be $100 or so, but healthcare records can get $1,000 or more on the dark web because of all the PII that's in there and the usefulness in obtaining controlled drugs, for instance, or committing insurance fraud, and ultimately identity theft. And because the hospitals or the health insurance companies have all these records available online in their internal networks, that just makes it a really juicy target for the bad actors. And pharmaceutical companies, as a special case, generate lots of important data during the development of new drugs that, from a competitive standpoint, could be really, really valuable as well. And it represents the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars. So that all of those things taken together can really make healthcare organizations a big target. Another aspect, and like every other IT organization, healthcare organizations are moving to the cloud, and overall that should make things more secure. I think in general, infrastructure running in the cloud can be a lot more secure than your own infrastructure on-prem. But the problem is during that time where you're running a hybrid environment where you've got some of your infrastructure on-prem and some in the cloud, that whole combination of things, that hybrid environment, becomes way more complicated and opens up new forms of vulnerability that you need to be able to deal with and mitigate. So Luke, what was your experience?
It's funny. This is one slide. We talked about this the other day. Honestly, we could probably devote an entire webinar around the adoption of cloud technologies in healthcare and all the complexities surrounding it. But from my experience, perhaps the most pervasive issue here is identity and password synchronization. I can tell you that my previous employer was not a fan of promoting an on-premises domain controller into Azure AD and then storing our ntds.dit or AD database in the cloud, and inevitably the syncing of passwords. At the time, we were gauging both Microsoft's Azure and Amazon's AWS platforms as potential options when migrating apps up to the cloud. But a lot of this really comes down to evaluating your enterprise security posture and weighing the risks associated with cloud migration appropriately.
Yep. And finally, and this is something that's kind of obvious, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the hospital mission is entirely different than, say, a commercial mission. And if a hospital organization suffers a malware or ransomware attack that takes their IT offline for potentially days, it's not just losing tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars like, say, Maersk went through. It means that people die. So that makes the whole IT effort and the whole security effort way more critical. And finally, the thing that is kind of top of mind for everybody, although it seems like it's been top of mind for 6 months or not, is the COVID pandemic. And that's had some interesting effects on healthcare organizations, things that maybe aren't obvious. First off, like everybody else, it's driven a huge work from home movement for the administrative staff especially. Which means that IT has had to accelerate their adoption of bring your own device and remote access technologies. And then, of course, going along with remote access, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency from DHS published a whole truckload of multiple remotely exploitable vulnerabilities in popular VPN appliances from Palo Alto and so on. Mm-hmm. And RDP itself, the remote desktop protocol, has historically been a total dumpster fire as far as security vulnerabilities are concerned. So the orgs that don't take the right kind of precautions and put the right mitigations in place for these remote access technologies are just opening up the doors to attack. And the one aspect of COVID with respect to healthcare was really surprising to me is the fact that it's had a very negative financial impact on healthcare organizations, which is a little, I guess, is non-obvious. You would think with more healthcare activity, there would be more money coming in, but in fact, it's often the opposite.
Absolutely,
because hospitals are putting off those money-making procedures that they counted on for revenue and having to take on a lot more non-revenue kinds of procedures related to COVID.
Just I can personally attest to this. I know several former colleagues of mine who have been dealing with salary cuts ranging anywhere from 10 to 30%, dating all the way back to March when this pandemic started and got pretty hot and heavy. But we're some of the hospitals that are in the larger cities that have been more affected and dealing with increased caseloads that you mentioned. There's a lot of other facilities in more rural areas. I mean, I know you're out in Idaho. There's probably a lot out there as well where, they've had to cut staff due to the reductions in many of those elective surgeries you're talking about. That's why we're seeing a lot of the mobile health care and clinics and this telehealth concept. It's certainly on the rise, and I don't anticipate that that's going to go away anytime soon. I think that's probably going to stick around.
Yeah, I think you're right. And with this negative financial impact, this means that it's harder for healthcare organizations to move forward with security projects that they had, say, budgeted for, and now maybe can't have to put off for another 6 months or another year.
Right.
And it's not like the criminals are going away. It's not like they're ignorant of this going on. Okay, so this brings us to our first polling question. Now, I encourage you to answer these carefully. Our marketing department really relies on these polling answers. We collect a lot of data this way, and it ultimately shows up in the way we do marketing events and the way we do actually the features we put in our products. So take a little time and provide a considered answer to these questions here, and we'll go on.
I like that.
Well, you have kids at home, so you know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh, amen, brother. We've talked about this once or twice. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, my kids are out of the house, so I don't have to deal with the sort of educational workload at home. That's something that I managed to avoid this time around.
I had to make sure before we kicked this off, the doors were closed, so I didn't hear my wife trying to teach the kids and not yell at them.
Okay, let's take a quick look at what we've got going here. Not many people watching Mulan, so that's interesting. I'm a little surprised.
I saw
and
once.
quite a few people who just never bothered to go to the office at all. I'm with you. I think I've been working from home for the last 10 years, so this whole thing has not had a big work effect for me. But I know a lot of other people who are struggling with it.
Yeah.
And I agree. I miss going to the office too. Okay, upward and onward. So we've talked quite a bit about what it is that makes healthcare organizations such a interesting target to cyber criminals and cybercrime. What we're going to do now is talk a little bit about how to get a handle on that, get that a little more under control, and improve your security posture. So we'll talk about three things. One is make sure you're doing the basics well. And this is something I stress to pretty much everybody I talk to about security. Just doing the basics will get you 90% of the way there. It's all the stuff that we know about. If you can do that really, really well, religiously well, you will save yourself a lot of grief and make your environment quite a bit more secure. Second thing we'll talk about is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It's a really good framework for structuring your security activities and planning them. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that applies to healthcare. And then finally, the notion of zero trust. And this is a real popular industry buzz term right now, but it actually has some real value too. And we'll talk about adopting a zero trust, identity-centric approach to security overall. Okay, so Luke, I'm going to turn this one on the basics over to you.
All right, sounds good. Do the basics well. Patch. We can't overstress just how vital patching systems and software is for any organization, really. That's critical across the board. Least privilege access control. It's the principle of least privilege and role-based access controls. It should be a philosophy across all sectors, really, not just healthcare. And this admin tiering. So this is a good point here. I've seen this implemented in many forms, ranging from Microsoft's EMEA or Red Forest concept to having different accounts that serve different purposes. So what I mean by that is you have your day-to-day account that you leverage for logging and checking email, running user-based applications that basically don't require any sort of privilege level access. And then you have a kind of a secondary or mid-tier account that's used for a lot of that privilege level admin type work, meaning that you're rarely utilizing those highly sensitive accounts like your domain and enterprise admin accounts, unless there's specific work that needs to be done that requires those explicit rights. Pause. So, on the same note, domain and enterprise admin accounts, they can be controlled via the pause privilege level access workstations, privilege access workstations they're just essentially they're workstations that are hardened, and you're logging on with that privilege account onto these pause systems. I know Microsoft's got a whole course. It's like a week long that can step you through the pause concepts and how to leverage a pause system. And I've seen implement MFA or passwordless solutions. Passwordless solutions becoming huge, I feel like, in the last 12 to 24 months. I've seen various forms of MFA. My previous organization, we used MFA on all the privilege accounts that we were talking about. We initially start off with smart cards, eventually migrated over to YubiKey, but you've got U2F, OTPs or one-time passwords. I mean, the list really goes on. I've even seen companies leverage their own home-built apps for privilege access management, or look at investing in other commercially available products. And there's a lot of solutions.
Go
ahead.
The point behind the pause and admin tiering and all of that is to make sure that privileged account credentials don't end up on more vulnerable devices. So the idea being that you don't want a domain admin to log into some random workstation on the floor, because those credentials that are associated with Kerberos and single sign-on and all that are sitting in memory and could be compromised there. So that's sort of the whole mental model. The thing you want to think about is how do you keep privileged credentials away from devices that are more easily compromised.
And that's hard to do, right? If you're logging in every day, your desktop, I mean, you install those Microsoft admin toolkits locally on your desktop, and you're right. We've all done it, but I think that's a valid point you're making there.
Yeah.
Endpoint email security tools, big one. Think of a few names right off the top of my head. There's numerous solutions out on the market for both endpoint and email security.
Yep.
Understand and mitigate risks from third-party service providers. So mitigating risks from third-party service providers can be a bit of a burden. It might involve digging into why does the back-end code on this particular application require domain admin or account operator rights, and how do we work with the vendor to come up with a better solution to this? My previous employer, we did a lot of that, helping a lot of these third-party vendor apps to work with their code, to say, hey, let's change our base DN search. You're grabbing, 300,000 user accounts. You really only need to look your base DN at this OU structure level here, and we can make your code a little more efficient. But lastly, practice your DR scenarios. It's great to invest in a product that checks the box for high availability and business continuity purpose requirements, but how will you respond should the time come? I always like to knock on wood. If you have to use it in a real world situation, and if you haven't run through it multiple iterations of testing it, you're going to be at a loss. So having a DR plan is great, but business leaders need to make testing this DR plan a priority on at least an annual, if not semi-annual basis. Obviously, I know that means coordinating with your networking and firewall teams, your identity and access management security group, other critical business applications. Everybody needs to be included in that process.
Yeah, the full-scale disaster recovery planning and practice is a challenge for everybody. I worked with a customer several years ago who literally, this came from their executive management. They took 2 days and ran I think this was every year. They took 2 days and ran a full DR scenario. Every year they would come up with a new simulated failure of some sort, like, meteor hits the data center or something like that. And they would go through, all the IT staff would be working on this particular recovery process. And it's expensive, but when the time comes, if you haven't practiced your DR plan, you're just not going to be able to do it. Okay, so the next item that we recommend you take a look at is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And this was something that NIST came up with, I want to say, maybe probably 4 years ago, and it's been updated recently within the last year and a half, couple of years. And it's not like prescriptive guidance about how you configure things or how you organize, how you actually implement certain security processes. It's a framework for thinking about and planning, and it's tremendously useful. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's sort of simple and obvious too, but it breaks the whole security planning process up into 5 components. Identify, which means this is really just getting a handle on the systems that you have to protect, what the interactions between them are, what the capabilities are that you have in place for securing them, what the risk profiles are. So this is where you would do risk assessments. What people you have in place, are they trained? Do they know what they have to do? So all of this is sort of data gathering for the planning and implementation process. The second component is protect, which is where you do these things that will protect your systems and make them more resilient to cyber attack. Third one is detect, which means to detect an actual attack in progress. The fourth one is respond, which is to do something in response to an attack when it occurs. And finally, the fifth one is recover. So assuming that the attack has actually caused some damage, you have to go through the steps to recover the systems to get them to a point where they're functioning properly again. And you can think, we actually use this framework internally as part of our product planning to understand the features that we want to build into our products. And we've even simplified this a little bit more into those things that you do before an event. So that would be identify and protect. The things that you do during an event, which would be correspond to detect and respond. And finally, the things that you do after the event, which is essentially recover.
Mm-hmm. You know, before I made my transition into the healthcare vertical, I spent more than 11 years, as I mentioned earlier, working in the cleared sector of the U.S. government, supporting many of the three-letter agencies. I actually see here Jonas out in Northern Virginia, shout out. I see Northrop Grumman as a company on there. So I presume, based on your location and company, you're probably in that sector as well. But the point I'm driving at is that I can tell you NIST Cybersecurity Framework and their risk management framework, they provide the foremost guiding principles behind all IT security practices within all those aspects of the Department of Defense and all the agencies that support it. You know, you're not in cybersecurity in the U.S. government if you're not reading through those NIST documentations. So,
yeah, it's a great resource for people, and this framework is, like I said, it's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward, but it's a great way to organize your thinking and planning around security. So let's talk a little bit about the things that you can do before the event occurs. So Luke, why don't you talk us through some of the things that you've done in terms of identifying and protecting
Sure.
healthcare system?
Yeah, no, great. So I think this is where we kind of get to dive deep into some of those real world scenarios, real world stories. While I was supporting the healthcare industry, I was a member of a larger project team. We were actively working to phase out some of the legacy authentication protocols within our environment. So NTLM version 1, version 2, so on and so forth. Windows 10 were default NTLM v4. And obviously a lot of this corresponds to the before aspect or identify part of the NIST cybersecurity framework. But ultimately we leveraged group policy to phase out these older versions of NTLM. Initially, what we did was, we called it internally, we referred to it as kind of a ring topology, which doesn't really, it's not a ring topology, but what we would do is initially push it out to the clients, right? And then the servers, and there'd be a lot of testing with the various applications that were leveraging some of those older legacy authentication protocols. And then eventually, at the later part of this, we would flip the bit on the domain controllers to disallow these protocols entirely once we had successfully remediated all the issues and we felt confident that the app was able to operate at that next level of authentication. But like I mentioned, we had various rings for NTLM v1, v2, v3, v4, to run through the testing. And it was a lengthy process. We I think spent more than 12 months working on this. But we conducted it in phases, and we took some time coordinating and communicating with, other teams, a lot of those business applications that were still leveraging some of those older NTLM authentication protocols. And ultimately, it ended up a success that, we focused around, like I said, identify and protect the organization. And it was heavily influenced by NIST's guiding principles. Actually, I've got another one here. It's our next story here that I've got. It comes from a leader in the identity and access governance space at another healthcare company. He's based in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm just going to read. He sent it the other day. So this is his words. An architect for my organization had reviewed the LAPS, or local admin password solution product that Microsoft provided. They wanted to see if it was possible to develop a method to constantly adjust permissions and control administrative access to workstations in much the same way that LAPS changed passwords for the administrative account. So back in 2015, we wanted to see if it could be done to control localized administrative access in a centralized fashion. So the solution had to meet a couple of requirements. First, it had to be centrally managed, centralized and easily managed. Second, it had to be flexible, since at the time we were dealing with 160 plus hospitals and surgery centers. Third, it had to be enforceable. Fourth, it had to be secure with regard to restricting the accounts. And lastly, it had to be dependable. So instead of using an agent like Microsoft's LAPS does, we decided the best method would be to leverage Active Directory itself. This provided a centralized repository for identification and distribution of rights. So the flexibility would come from the fact that access would be based on groups within AD, but the central repository for the access would be stored within a special set of attributes on the computer objects themselves. So to ensure that the attributes were secure, they would be hidden and only viewable by members of our domain admins group. We used group names that were set to be members of administrators' local devices, were stored in those attributes, and a script would run periodically that would check against those attributes in AD to verify that the groups and their membership match the requirements of the control list that was built within the app. So in order to enforce the process in the absence of a secondary application or agent, we had to leverage what was built into the operating system. So the GP SBC service runs on every device every 90 minutes. We deployed a scheduled task to each device that essentially ran a script to check the local group membership and compare it against the information stored in the AD attributes of the computer object. That's slick. The script leveraging group policy, the script that was leveraging the group policy service ensured that any changes made outside of the controls would be rewritten within 90 minutes when that GP SVC would run. That's smart. So this process was achievable because data types, object types, and naming code, this is important, and naming conventions were all standardized. Big point. Allowing processes to be automated and enforceable. And he highlighted this part here. This does not work in a non-standardized environment. So it turns out the process worked so well that LAPS was not needed at all, and all local administrator accounts on workstations were disabled. It was a collaborative effort between several members of our IAMs and security team. Funny story is we actually left an Easter egg in the code that stamped my user ID, this guy, his words, in a file on some of the devices. Every so often, security would get a call asking, who is this guy and why is he putting stuff on my PC? I love that one.
IT guys, they're the same everywhere. It's interesting. So that's a great example of a project inside a healthcare organization to protect the environment by basically removing local administrative rights on the endpoints themselves.
Right.
Which is an important thing to do because malware, as a rule, comes in through the workstations.
Yep. Amen.
So let's talk a little bit about the second component of the NIST framework here. The things you do during the event. So in the NIST terms, it's detect and respond. So Luke, you've got some stories here too.
I got another one from the field here, if you don't mind. I'll just jump right into it.
Yep.
So this is back in 2010. There was an instance of a worm that got caught by our TAVM, Threat Assessment and Vulnerability Management team. A device was isolated and wiped. Unfortunately, in order to remediate, we had to determine a way to universally prevent the executable from infesting other devices should someone else open the email. The worm in question was W32/VBmania@MM, or more commonly, VBmania. At the time, we did not have a centralized endpoint protection suite, so that wouldn't give us sufficient coverage. The second option was SCCM, to see if there might be some way to build a rule to prevent installation. Again, that left nearly 20% of the Windows environment vulnerable because SCCM didn't provide enough coverage. So the only thing that offered 100% coverage to Windows devices was Active Directory and group policy. I'm seeing a theme here. Gil, you seeing this? The TABM team, the threat assessment team, vulnerability management team, had a copy of the worm, and we took it to an offline laptop. It was connected to nothing. We copied the file hash of the executable. Okay, I get you. We then took that hash and imported it into a GPO to create a software restriction policy. Okay, I see what he's saying. So then we would run a script to schedule all devices to reboot within a window of about 12 hours. This is to make sure that the policy properly applied, because software restriction policies only apply at boot, right? Once this is complete, the TABM team monitored on a regular basis and found that while a small number of cases did show up, none were executed because of the policy. It's another success story from the field.
Yeah, very cool.
And actually, oh no, go ahead. I was going to say, so the detect and respond, it was making me think about, another problem I frequently had to address, my former employer, was related to user account lockouts. So the majority of the time, these incidents are just as they appear on the surface, but every so often we'd see an instance where the identity and access management team had to get involved to help troubleshoot and isolate the root cause and the source device for these lockouts. And that became even more difficult when you're starting to deal with users coming in through proxy devices that don't log those failed authentication attempts, and or federated apps, O365, that aren't logging this data. In one isolated incident, we had a user whose account was getting locked out before the unlock had enough time to replicate across all DCs in our environment. So obviously that turned out to be an active brute force attack, and we had to engage our cybersecurity and incident response team for help. But as I recall, we isolated, blocked the source IP address in the incident, and had to communicate and coordinate. They were key in getting this resolved. And our concentration was around NIST Cybersecurity Framework principles. It drove us down the right path to success.
Yeah. It's another example of sort of detecting and really responding to a cyber event, and even recovering from it as well.
Absolutely.
And so it's just another example of how the NIST framework can really apply to your security efforts. So the next one we want to take a look at here is, where has my window gone? There we go. Is recover. So what do you do after the event? Our focus is identity and access management, in particular hybrid identity systems. If you look at the typical healthcare environment, it will be Active Directory on-prem plus a couple of hundred applications, some of which are AD integrated and some of which aren't. And usually something like AWS or Azure or sometimes Google. And all of those are distinct identity systems. And even when things are, quote, AD integrated, it doesn't mean that they really are AD integrated. It doesn't behave like it's part of the Active Directory environment. So you need to think about the whole identity system as an overall system, not just separate components. But typically, in fact, in all the cases I'm aware of, Active Directory is still the core component. Active Directory is the thing that people log into. It's the thing that controls access through group memberships. And it's the source of attribute data that gets pushed to, if you have a synchronization product of some sort, it'll take attribute data out of AD and push it into into all these applications, if you're lucky. In other cases, that's a manual process. The problem with AD and recovery is that AD was designed not to fail. It was designed to be very robust, and it is. It's very distributed. If you have 20 domain controllers and you take 5 of them offline, AD still works. It was never really designed to be recovered from backup. And in practice, in the past, that's not been much of a problem because there were very, very few situations where you would actually have to recover your AD from backup. And consequently, the recovery process is kind of complicated. But now with ransomware and wiperware and that sort of thing, the threat scenario, the threat equation is different. Organizations are way more likely to have to deal with a situation where you're recovering your entire AD from backup. Maersk is a good example, not a healthcare example, but a big shipping company that was attacked by the NotPetya virus. They got flattened. Something like 40,000 devices globally were wiped and unrecoverable within an hour. And what they discovered is not only was it all the workstations and all their servers, but Active Directory, of course, was wiped out as well, and they had to recover Active Directory from backup, but oh no, the backups were wiped out too. So now they were forced to recover their Active Directory from scratch, and it was a major project. I think it took about 4 days to recover their Active Directory, and it was only because they found one domain controller that had been powered off at the time because of a power failure. Somewhere in Ghana, I think it was. They sent someone down in a jet to pick up the disk and bring it back to London, and then they ultimately rebuilt their Active Directory environment from scratch from that one disk. So that's an example of how you can recover from an Active Directory environment. The threat equation now is entirely different. You need to plan for recovering your AD from scratch, whereas that never used to be really a priority. It needs to be now because of the prevalence of ransomware and wiperware. Okay, let's go on to our third recommendation here, and this is adopt a zero trust identity-centric approach. So every organization now is dealing with the cloud and some sort of hybrid identity environment. So they've got their on-prem Active Directory environment and some sort of identity system in the cloud. And they have users who are accessing their systems both from on-prem and from outside the organization entirely. So this whole notion where we used to rely on people being inside the firewall, and if you were on a workstation connected to the network, then you were good to go, that just doesn't apply anymore. I think Forrester a few years ago came up with this notion of zero trust. And it essentially means that any user or any device that's performing an operation on your IT resources, you shouldn't just assume that it's valid. You need to verify that operation each time. And that verification might be an authorization check, or it might be re-authentication of some sort, or it might be a risk-based authentication where if the device is, say, outside your firewall or it's not a device you've seen before, you go through an extra two-factor step, something like that. But the whole model is to not rely on the validity of a session indicating some sort of privilege to perform an operation. And this model is really important now, not just for the healthcare industry, obviously, but for everyone. As you're moving more of your resources outside your firewall and more of your people are outside your firewall, you need to rethink your identity approach to incorporate this sort of identity-centric. You need to rethink your security and incorporate this identity-centric approach. One of the indications that this is something you should think about is if you look at all of the data breaches that have occurred, I think this was the 2019 Verizon report, 80% of those data breaches come from some sort of compromised credentials, and credentials are typically stored in your identity system someplace, right? It'll be in Active Directory or in Azure Active Directory or in application databases or whatever, but it's by definition an identity problem. And if you have 80% of the data breaches coming from compromised credentials, you need to rethink the way you're approaching security to incorporate your identity systems.
That's right. Identity is a new perimeter, right?
Yeah, that is absolutely the case.
Concept of hybrid identity solutions was a big problem for us. I know a lot of business critical applications would develop their own internal identity systems for user authentication and authorization. But especially when we were dealing with apps that were supposedly AD integrated, we on the IAM team, we would manage AD, but we'd have no insight into that back-end code for these apps. I think I commented on that a little while earlier, but one of the ways we slowly started to get a handle on this was devoting explicit resources within our team to work both internally within the organization, as well as reaching out to vendor support folks to identify issues. I recall spending countless hours on support calls looking at LDAP configs for various apps, helping guide vendors on rewriting their LDAP configs to be efficient for our environment, modifying the code to eliminate grabbing stale user accounts, specifying an efficient base DN search, make sure they're leveraging port 636 instead of 389 for secure LDAP. Just a few examples off the top of my head.
Yeah, we've had Active Directory for 20 years, and there's so many apps that are being developed that still don't know how to use Active Directory properly. They might even be tied to a specific domain controller or something like that. Okay. Just as a quick note, there's an organization called the IDSA, the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. Semperis is actually part of this organization. It's a group of identity and security vendors promoting the notion of identity as the cornerstone of your security activity and producing best practices and training and things like that. So take a look at their website at idsalliance.org. And we got our second round of questions here. To what degree has your organization adopted a zero trust approach to security? And I'll give you a little time to respond to that. And don't bail out just yet, because we've got an offer at the end of this. So go ahead and answer the questions here, and I'll let you in on the secret. Okay, how are we doing? Okay, we're getting some response here. So interesting. Nobody is asking the question, what is zero trust? That's good to hear. Talking about it and not doing anything with it, yes, that's about what I expected. And there's a substantial group of people who zero trust guides their entire approach to IT security. So that's really good to hear. Okay, thank you for that. So just to wrap up, we've talked about 3 different ways to help get control of your security posture in the healthcare industry. We've talked about why healthcare is such a unique proposition in IT security. Luke went over the basics and how that can really help you maintain security and achieve a better level of security by doing the basics properly. We talked about using the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and how adopting an identity-focused or zero-trust approach can improve your security as well. Now, we've partnered in the past with Andy Greenberg. Andy Greenberg is an author. He wrote this book here, SANDWORM, if you can see it. There you go. It's a story about Russian hacking groups and their effect on sort of the global internet and individual corporations. He goes into a lot of detail about the Maersk event. It's a great book. It's an easy read. It's a fun read. I'll say it's not quite Tom Clancy, but it's pretty close. It's about as close as you're going to get computer stuff to be to Tom Clancy. And if you go to the link here on the slide, we can fix you up with a copy of it. It's a really good book. It's also useful to give to your management if you're having trouble getting them to understand the risks associated with cyber criminals. It's a fun read, and it gives you some common context when you're talking about particular kinds of events. And finally, we got some resources for you. We put on a conference every year called the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference. We're doing it online this year. You can check it out at hipconf.com. You can subscribe for updates, and in the next few days, you'll be able to register for the conference as well. Also, my colleague Sean Doobie does a podcast. You can check that out on our website. There are a bunch of really good podcasts. He interviews cybersecurity professionals from around the industry, and they're a good listen as well. And of course, I've got to suggest that you check out our website and check out our products as well. And I think that should just about take care of it. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us today. Raquel, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Gil and Luke, for being with us today. It looks like we ran out of time for Q&A, so if you did ask a question, Luke or Gil or someone from the Semperis team will reach out to you with an answer via email. But with that, this concludes today's webcast, which was sponsored by presented by Redmond Magazine and sponsored by Semperis. I hope you have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, guys.